Okay, hi everyone, welcome back to English 484W. So this week we're looking at two texts, the modern intimate and clams. So one of the ways that I wanted to put these two texts into conversation is their depiction of these commitment-phobic men, and perhaps also a little bit of a commitment-phobic woman with the Carrie character who doesn't uninstall Tinder from her phone despite being in a 6-month relationship. So in this video, I just want to kind of do a sociological explanation of why these characters might be commitment phobic. What are the kind of the social forces at play? And yeah, I'm just going to get into my PowerPoint. So I've chosen the kind of, maybe I'm showing my age here because I'm not completely comfortable with how well I actually understand this term. But I think, so describing kind of commitment phobic men, the term fuckboys has been used. And I think I would classify, from my understanding of the term fuckboy, I would classify both Nate in Clams and Eric in the modern intimate as fuckboys. But I'm not sure if I'm completely using the term right, but we'll see. Okay, so looking at looking at Eric first. So these are just some details from the story that I pulled out about him. They're kind of funny when you just kind of look at them all together. I'm not sure if I'm going to read them, but one of the interesting things, and one of the things that I think Carly Baker, the author, does in the story a lot, is she shows a lot of kind of character just by these things that don't seem like they're expositions of character. But in describing Eric's style of texting, so I'll just read this part. So, has perfected the art of texting while darting through a crowd. It's all in the peripheral vision, the ability to focus on two things at once. So just taking a kind of a thing that we all kind of do, multitasking, or I know probably a lot of us, myself included, when you watch a movie these days, sometimes we're also looking at our phone. Sometimes, horror of horrors, we're doing like three things at the same time. We're looking at three different screens at the same time. So this is always obviously a lot different from like reading a book when you can't really read two books at the same time. Maybe some of you have experimented with reading a book while watching a movie. Hopefully not the books in this course. I'm not sure how that would work. But just in this little kind of habit of Eric's of multitasking, there's also kind of some of his character exposed in that he also likes to kind of focus on perhaps two women at the same time, as the woman he's messaging on Tinder and his girlfriend of 6 months at the same time. He seems to be equally involved in those two relationships and perhaps more relationships. Yeah, another kind of one of those little details that shows a lot about a character. The neutrality of a hotel room is one of his favorite things. Yeah. I'm not exactly clear what that says about his character, but obviously he kind of likes this kind of sanitized, a little bit fake, something where he can just kind of not leave any trace. Yeah, that kind of preference, I think, also says a little bit about him. And then there's the health focus, which he's very focused on kind of improving his self. And we'll kind of get to the significance of that a little bit later in this presentation. Okay, and then there's the other character from Megan Boyle's story, Nate. And if there's not that much information about Eric in the other story, there's very little information about Nate. Almost zero information, especially when she first has the encounter with him. The author really kind of withholds giving any kind of details about this person. I went through the story a couple times. I didn't really notice any kind of physical descriptions of him apart from his calves, which is kind of it's hard to build a picture of a person off of that. But even in just kind of his personality, there's very kind of little description of him. So at different points in the story, he's called quiet, he's called unsure. He has that kind of line that I find kind of amusing. Honesty is the only thing that leads to significant experiences. At one point, the narrator calls him and again, this kind of funny hybrid child robot. when he leaves, the narrator is describing the smell he left on the pillow as hazily good and masculine. So like hazily good, like again, not very definite. Kind of still very broad, very general. And then near the end of the story, she tries to remember kissing him, but she kind of realizes that his mouth has no distinguishable taste. So I think there's a lot to this presentation of this character as just being kind of general, kind of just nothing really there, kind of a ghost. Um, and yeah, I just have this image of a man in a grocery store and kind of mulling over the many different choices that he has, which I think is a image that kind of speaks to me about this character. He does feel like uh, he's just kind of deciding among things in a grocery store when it comes to people. Okay, so getting into kind of like the sociological explanation of these fuckboys, I think this text by Avella Lose, who is a sociological theorist, we're actually going to read some of her later in the semester when we look at You. But she published this very kind of influential book called Cold Intimacies, The Making of Emotional Capitalism, back in 2007. And I'm just going to show some kind of definitions of what she means exactly by cold intimacy, which I think applies to both these two stories. Okay, so one of the things about cold intimacy, which Aluz is kind of talking about in terms of like the dating scene today, is that there's a privileging of reason, efficiency, and choice over kind of expressions of passion. So we kind of will see that when looking at kind of more specifically Tinder, when there's a kind of a lot of choice that's available there, you kind of have to be efficient in terms of who you communicate with. Um, there's kind of a lot of rational thinking perhaps going on, especially in the story by Carly Baker, where like the character of Eric, his feelings toward uh, the I guess the protagonist Carrie are kind of wishy-washy. He's kind of more thinking about it at the level of kind of reason rather than any kind of passion. And this kind of lack of passion is expressed in both stories. So yeah, here's Eric's description. He's just not feeling it, or really he thinks he should be feeling it more. And then Nate in Megan Boyle's story, I don't have feelings for you. I don't feel emotionally attached to you. I just had sex with you. So there's kind of this vacuum of genuine emotion in both stories. Another thing that Aluz kind of talks about in Cold Intimacies is kind of the contemporary transition to, and this she kind of does a long backdrop through like psychology, the kind of the popularity of psychology today, where there's a focus on personal development of an authentic or honest self rather than finding self through others. So that's kind of like the self development that's going on in the modern intimate, where these characters are continually developing themselves. And also in Nate's kind of focus on honesty in that earlier line. So Nate has this line, it seems like it really matters what I think of you. And he says it in a kind of a confrontational style toward the protagonist of Clams, Anne, as if that's a bad thing. And Anne kind of defensively says that, yeah, of course, of course it matters to me what other people, not just you, but everyone kind of thinks of me. So she's someone who kind of can find herself through other people, whereas Nate seems to be, there's not a lot of information, but he seems to be more um, just focused on himself and being honest with himself, and not kind of really caring perhaps what Anne thinks of him, or at least he never really expresses any kind of care about what Anne thinks of him. And then this is just a quote from the second story, The Modern Intimate, at the bottom here. So Eric, I'm kind of just taking a little detail and kind of extrapolating from it, but he says he closes his eyes and moves through the inside of his body from head to toes, just focusing on himself. So this is kind of the meditation practice that he learned from the mayor of Vancouver, which might be I don't. The story is set during the time of the chemical spill, so that might have been Gregor Robertson, but I'm not completely sure. But yeah, he's uh, he's very kind of self-focused. I think that's obvious from the story. And yeah, one final detail that Aluz kind of talks about in this text is looking at relationships as an extension of working life. And I just have this quote from another kind of sociologist, Rachel Thwaites, who is commenting on Avella Lose's text, and she talks about kind of contemporary dating. One will be looking to do the best deal within this market and be thinking about how one can trade up or what one might lose by doing the wrong detail. So in the modern, this kind of detail is more aimed at the modern intimate. There is a juxtaposition in the story between the Eric's kind of working life and his romantic life with Carrie. So that juxtaposition, I think, is intentional. There's a certain kind of uh, habits that are encouraged in Eric's working life, like he has this drive to kind of make connections at this uh, networking conference. He says the line about how three connections in one day is kind of like the holy grail. So again, there's this drive in his working life to make multiple connections and to be really efficient in his communication. So uh, he and Mathilde have that conversation about the duds sitting around the table. They don't want to be caught in conversations with these people because they're kind of lower people. They want to just and they want to just really make efficient use of their time, communicate with the best people that they can, and this kind of attitude in his working life, uh, there appears to be a certain bleeding effect where it's bleeding into his romantic life, where he does have this kind of similar urge to make multiple connections and to not waste time with just one person. Okay, so I just have a getting back to the kind of the topic of fuckboys. So Nietzsche is obviously not commenting directly on fuckboys here, but I think it applies. So just the quote might be helpful. The breeding of an animal that can promise is not this just that very paradox of a task which nature has set itself in regard to man. Is not this the very problem of man? So even as far back as when Nietzsche was writing, the idea of making a promise is kind of something that a lot of people, I think, struggle with, not just based on gender, but a promise involves this kind of a trapping of the present into the future. So you sacrifice some of the present by kind of holding on to this illusion of a future, and obviously that's kind of related to kind of romantic commitment, where obviously you might feel a lot of different things in the present, like Eric in the story. He has this kind of chemistry perhaps with Mathilde that he doesn't really act on. He has a line about how he says he wonders why he didn't make a move on her. Well, that's probably the promise that you make in a romantic relationship, that you will kind of be both focused on a future together rather than just kind of living in the present where all kinds of kind of different emotions can come over you. So yeah, it's kind of a philosophical question that fuckboys raise. Okay, so there's this. I'm just going to go back into kind of a history of fuckboys, and there's an argument to be made that women are the original fuckboys, at least in the 19th century, and even going kind of further back. So just to kind of give an idea of like how plastic kind of gender stereotypes are. Like we obviously have the stereotype today that men are completely sexually driven, whereas women are kind of less sexually driven. That's kind of the stereotype. But going back to kind of like Christian times, way back into like the Middle Ages and stuff, women were viewed as kind of the more sexually driven members of the human race, whereas men were kind of much less sexually driven. So this kind of being swapped now, or reversed now in the present. But obviously, it's not kind of any kind of inherent, I don't think, trait, but something that kind of shifts with the times. So um, That all began to change with this text called Pamela, or a novel by Pamela, written by, the last name is Richardson. I forgot the first name. I'll double check that. But yeah, in this story, there's a character of Pamela who is kind of very sexually driven, and she's pursued by this man. And the woman kind of goes through this change where she realizes that not being completely sexually driven, but rather kind of holding back, being abstinent, kind of uh, pushing this man away is kind of what rate is what kind of increases this man's desire. So in this character, in this kind of Bildungsroman, the woman learns that by kind of restraining her sexuality, she can kind of increase the desire of the man. And the man in the story is kind of upper class, and because Pamela uh, kind of pushes him back so many times, he falls deeply in love with her and then marries her. So it's kind of like a moral story where if women could only hold back their sexuality, uh, then that can kind of lead to kind of a greater value, perhaps in the marriage market. So yeah, and just kind of going forward through history, there's kind of the 19th century British man, which kind of viewed women as the fuckboys. So the 19th century British man, there was a kind of a culture where expressing sentiment, expressing strong feelings for a woman was encouraged, and was actually one of the tests that women or society in general would kind of put men through to make sure that they were serious about their pursuit of a specific woman. So I just have some details that these men were kind of, or masculinity back then was framed as more vulnerable. So men would kind of pursue women. They would lay out all their feelings for them in letters or in conversation. They would kind of prove the strength of their feeling through gifts or just long or poems or writing or anything. Once they kind of made a choice on a woman, they wouldn't really change their minds that much. If they did, then there would be a kind of a big kind of backlash. So the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard changed his mind on the woman that he was going to marry for kind of unknown reasons, and he faced a backlash from the woman's family, from his own family, and from society in general. So it was not something that was encouraged back then at all. And a lot of these men kind of complained that the woman that they would write these kind of long, flowery letters expressing their love to, they would either be kind of slow to respond, or they wouldn't respond at all, or they would procrastinate. So yeah, so that idea of a fuckboy as kind of commitment phobic, it's definitely not kind of just like innate to men, but it kind of shifts over time. Okay, and then Avella Lose, who I've kind of referenced already, and she kind of expresses this change. So she writes, modern, and this is from Why Love Hurts, which is kind of the follow-up to Cold Intimacies. She writes, modern masculinity is more often expressed by a withholding rather than a demonstration of sentiment. Conversely, in the 19th century, women were more likely than men to be emotionally reserved, while today they are more likely to be emotionally expressive. Okay, so I was reading just some articles about Tinder, and there was this quote that came up where the interviewer asked these kind of college age women that were using Tinder quite a bit, are all men fuckboys? And the women, the women said, one of the women said yes, 100%. Another woman said no, maybe like 90%. But there is kind of the idea that this kind of covers a lot of men today. So just kind of some maybe explanations of that. And these are all from a Lose that I'm just quoting kind of reasons why kind of men would be fuckboys to like such an extent as this. So she writes, men, and these are just various answers, men use various strategies to maintain control over relationships, such as not wanting to commit and displaying unpredictable behavior, e.g. standing up women, being vague about future dates, making work a priority, etc. So obviously this kind of really strongly applies to the character of Eric. Um, So yeah, he does he does pretty much all of this, and Aluz kind of points it out as a way to kind of maintain control over this relationship by kind of perpetually like destabilizing it and making uh, Carrie kind of question what's going on. He can kind of be in the driver's seat of it. Here's kind of a more kind of pessimistic, and Aluz at this point is kind of quoting from a prominent feminist theorist, Firestone, where she has the idea that boys and men are emotional parasites. That is, they can take love but not generate or return it to provide the kind of emotional sustenance women need. So here, a very kind of pessimistic view of men, but perhaps accurate. And here's Aluz again. Commitment phobia can be viewed as an aspect of compulsory heterosexuality, one of the main institutionalized descriptions of the ways in which women are systematically humiliated, dismissed, and ignored by men. So yeah, commitment phobia, at least today, Aluz seems to be gesturing to how, at least in these two stories too, it kind of affects women more than men. And then in that way, it can kind of be a continuation of kind of patriarchal relationships from the past. Okay, but and Aluz kind of has a pushback here against some of those kind of more pessimistic views of men today. She kind of wants to get into the exact reasons why men might behave as fuckboys, and not just because they're kind of evil or emotional parasites, but there might be kind of social reasons for this behavior that makes this behavior kind of encouraged or pleasurable. And one of the arguments that Aluz arrives at is that because kind of masculinity has obviously been very kind of challenged today, or even kind of some people think destroyed, in that all the kind of old ways that we used to define masculinity, which were kind of very kind of oppressive, like men being the head of the household, men kind of being the main kind of breadwinners for the family. These kind of ideals of masculinity have faded away. They haven't completely disappeared, but there's still a kind of a gender pay gap. But it's kind of clear that now today, at least men and women are on kind of more equal footing. And that leaves men, a lot of men, kind of curious about what defines them as men. They're not the kind of the hunters of the past. So what does it mean to be a man today? And Deleuze makes the point that sexuality kind of fills in this gap. That sexuality is kind of the play or the area of social life where masculinity gets figured out. So she writes, sexuality has become one of the most significant status markers of masculinity. Male competitiveness, validation, and status were channeled through the realm of sexuality. So all these different arenas of social life where these kind of masculine values perhaps found an outlet. So like work, or hanging out at the bar or something like that with your man friends. Um, all of this kind of gets channeled into sexuality. See. Okay, so and even going back to something like the feminist, we kind of see that where the feminist character kind of goes and he has these kind of men who are uh, kind of giving him advice on women, and he describes this as very kind of emasculating. That these men kind of completely define masculinity by how many women they've slept with, and because the feminist hasn't slept with any women, that makes him not a real man in a way. But yeah, so Aluz has a couple more arguments here that I'll just kind of go through. So um, yeah, I think again going back to the character of Eric and perhaps Nate as well. Aluz writes how detachment and sexuality came to signal and organize the broader trope of autonomy and control, and thus of masculinity. And emotional detachment can be viewed as a metaphor for masculine autonomy. So in a world where kind of men are losing control over some of the kind of the institutions that they previously held, like the nuclear family, a way of maintaining control is by maintaining some control over your sexual life. And control, because sexuality is so important for men today to kind of define themselves as men, that control can be kind of really intense. And perhaps we see that in the character of Eric the most, that he does kind of like to control this relationship. And it might be a way for him to express his masculinity uh, through this kind of serious detachment. And perhaps also Nate. I mean, Nate is also a kind of a very detached character, but there's just not enough there, I feel like, to kind of read that much into him. Kind of being using this detachment as a metaphor for masculine autonomy, but it might fit. Um, yeah, and yeah, just one kind of final point, and this kind of also related to the Tinder trope going through the modern intimate. Um, yeah, so like ordinary men could kind of play this role that used to be dominated by like major kind of breadwinners back in the 1950s, where if you were kind of a if you made a lot of money back in the 1950s and you were a man, you could kind of enjoy multiple relationships with different women. But back then, in the 1950s, women weren't so eager to jump into bed with a man who perhaps didn't make any money or lived with his parents. But now I read a story about a man who, yeah, lived with his parents, didn't make that much money, but on Tinder, he could kind of be a god. So, yeah. Okay, and then just kind of a final question. Is Carrie a fuckboy? So, not really, obviously, because she does kind of really want commitment from Eric, but she does not uninstall her Tinder from her phone. So does that mean that she's also kind of a fuckboy? Um, and again, just some arguments from a Lose to help enlighten us, hopefully, about why these characters are behaving like this from a social perspective. Um, So Carrie, one of the reasons why she is kind of more commitment focused might be that she is uh, in her 30s. And I don't mean to be kind of like reductionist in terms of biology, but this is something that the 30-year-old women that I've talked to, it does come up that there is a little bit of a something that they have to think about, at least even if they don't want kids, they still have to kind of, at least if they're focused on, and it's not even if they want to be a mother, but if one day they might want to be a mother, they still have to kind of think about this. And it is a decision that I see being kind of pushed back later and later in life, to have kids. And there's a lot of kind of things that women have to think about that I don't think men obviously have to think about as much. So Aluz has the idea that um, so this exclusivist sexual strategy that kind of just means commitment focused, are actually motivated by more by a reproduction orientation than by a natural orientation toward men. So that reproduction orientation, kind of fancy language for just wanting to have a family. And yeah, I think so. The story that Carrie sends Eric, I don't know. I'm interested in your guys' reading of this, but it just seemed like I mean, it's very kind of sweet, but it also seems like a horrible idea. I didn't really get her reason for sending the story about the bunny rabbit. I mean, if it was me receiving that story, I would be kind of uh, not really understand it. Like, it is very sweet, but I don't know if it's something to do when you're sending an email to someone where it's kind of this like precarious communication, um, where the person you can't really talk with the person right away. So yeah, I'd be interested in what you guys thought about her sending the bunny rabbit kid story, the bedtime story. But it does kind of tie into her kind of having this reproduction orientation, or at least giving the impression that she kind of wants a family by sending this kid story with a mother that's chasing her child. Yeah, and this is, yeah, the second quote is kind of, yeah, talking about what I already talked about. Um, and so, sorry for that second message. Basically, just uh, in kind of the sexual marketplace or whatever, there is an abundance of choice, and that's kind of expressed through Tinder and the modern intimate. There is also kind of an abundance of choice, perhaps even in the other short story Clams, which might kind of hint at why Nate is so kind of resistant But yeah, so one of the kind of things that kind of reduces that abundance of choice for women is that yeah, there is this kind of ticking time frame or whatever compared to men. So there is kind of one limit on the kind of abundance of choice that they have to consider, and that kind of lessens their marketing power or bargaining power more than men. And yeah, this last quote from Alou just kind of, I think, really offers a really great explanation of why kind of Carrie hasn't uninstalled Tinder. And she writes that Alou writes that women adopted serial sexuality as a response to an imitation of men's power. By this means, the only appropriate response to detachment is greater detachment. So the reason why Carrie didn't uninstall Tinder is that she always kind of suspected that Eric might still be kind of using Tinder. So if you're faced with a romantic partner that is kind of operating this mode of detachment, you can kind of use the same kind of tool to kind of counter that. So she only uses Tinder as kind of a countering or defense mechanism to Eric using Tinder, which is kind of a pessimistic view of her using Tinder. So she's not really demonstrating agency or anything like that. She's just using it as a kind of a coping mechanism to deal with Eric. So yeah, I'd be curious if you guys agree with that pessimistic reading, or if she is kind of demonstrating some kind of sexual agency, if she is a fuckboy like Eric. So yeah, that's it. Just kind of a final quote to close things off. Kind of a lose overdose in this presentation, but I think she's really good to helping at least me understand this story better. And yeah, she has this term called emotional domination, and it's kind of one of the ways that kind of gender still haunts the sexual marketplace in a way. Even though the sexual marketplace of today with apps like Tinder, it seems like just free, anyone can do whatever they want, everyone has agency, you only have to talk to people who message you, but there's still certain kind of power relationships that kind of haunt this freedom. And in this quote, Aluz is kind of talking or gesturing to that. So if you want to read that quote, you can just pause the video. Otherwise, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye for now.